for more than 20 years before I became a politician. So it's nice to return a little bit to my old role. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. C'est un très grand plaisir pour moi. Vous êtes ici dans mon pays, au Canada. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Mohawk First Nation, and we thank them for allowing us to be here. This is a really important conversation that we're going to have with my colleagues here, especially, but not only my European ministerial colleagues. It's a conversation that we're very actively engaged in. And how I would sort of summarize the question before us is, how do we deal with and respond to the very powerful waves of anti-globalization sentiment that I think we are experiencing across the Western industrialized world? What do we think the roots are? And is there a positive, progressive response? We know that there are some very powerful feelings, that the mood is very powerful in many of our electorates. What is the right way for progressive politicians to deal with it? And since I'm also a politician, I might add my own points of view from time to time. But I'm going to start by asking my friend and colleague, Sigmar Gabriel, who is the Vice Chancellor of Germany. We're very grateful, Sigmar, that you're here with us. And he is working with me and Nikos on a very important trade agreement right now, so we have a lot to do with each other. But Sigmar, you know, how powerful is this anti-globalization feeling? What is driving it? And as leader of the SPD in Germany, what's your answer?
First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me, and I beg your pardon because my English is not as good as it should be, because I was, in my previous life, too much engaged in politics than in learning English. So I hope it will work. Now, I mean, if you look to my country, to Germany, or to other countries in Europe, you see that we have, for the first time in the history of modern Europe, a strong national populist movement. Sometimes and mostly on the right, but sometimes also on the left. And you can see that in Sweden we have a strong national party. I mean, it's the strongest one today in the polls. We have in France, Le Pen. It's interesting, if you ask the voters or the progressive parties, they said, okay, during the last 30 years, sometimes workers voted for the right-wing populists to show the government we are not satisfied. But it was something like a protest voting. They were not convinced that the right-wingers had the better answers, but they want to show the guys in the government we are not satisfied. Today, especially the workers said, no, they are really socialists, but national socialists. So they want to do the same things what the Socialist Party promised us, or the Communist Party socialists, but they are the only ones who are acting in the interest of the regular French citizens. We can see it in Austria. The right-winger who wants to be the next president got 50% of the voters. And even in Germany, I mean, because of our special history during the last century, we are 15% of right-wing voters, not more, but it can be more. What's the reason? People saw that the promises we all, also the Social Democrats, gave during the last 25 years did not fulfill in their normal life. Of course, there are a lot of winners of globalization, but there are also losers. And the majority of the losers came out of our voters. First step was not going to vote. The non-voters in Europe raised during the last 20 and 30 years. And now they have a special alternative a right-wing populist party in my country, other countries, where they feel now it makes sense to go to vote because they will change the policy in our way. So we have, during the beginning of the century, we had euphoric debates about globalization. Then people saw what happened during the financial crisis. We spent hundreds of billions of euros to stabilize the bank system. And at the same time, we told our voters that unfortunately we had not enough money to give them fair pensions, to invest in schools, or to expand the social security. Today, people in Germany ask us, some years ago you had a lot of money for the banking system, now you have a lot of money for refugees, what's about us? And then in this vacuum, the national politicians from the very right wing came in and gave them national arguments. And whatever we said, they do not trust us today. We are part of the establishment. They do not think that we are really interested in the regular life of workers and the working class. And so the way out is, first, that we need another story. And it has to be the story of solidarity among progressive parties and the people, their electorate. We have to rebuild our story of solidarity. The national right wing has also had a story of solidarity, but a very crazy story of solidarity, the solidarity of the own nation and the original people in one nation against others. And second is we have to join hands to find a new regulation for the capitalism. We were very successful in the last century to have national regulations for the capitalism. We were very successful. We expanded the social security, we expanded the wages, but now capitalism is internationalized. The only thing which is still on national focus on the progressive parties. So that would be my first answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Sigmar. And I'd like to bring you in, and I have been reading with great interest some of the pieces that you've been writing, translated into English for me. I don't read in Swedish. But some of the really interesting pieces you've been writing in the Swedish press about ways that we maintain, in the face of the forces that Sigmar has been describing, ways that we maintain and maybe build as progressive leaders public support for the open society, for being connected to the global economy. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and I also want to thank you for being the leader of a letter that I think was published today of 12 European ministers coming out in support of CETA, our progressive trade agreement with Europe. So thank you for that, and tell us how to build this public support, how Sweden does it.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with what Sigmar is saying, that there is a strong frustration over many things. And it takes the form of being against issues like free trade, CETA, but also migration and the open society. And I don't think it's difficult to find a reason for this. And just to give one example, if you see the income of normal families in the 25 most developed countries, between 1993 and 2004, it was only 2% who has flat or declining income. Between 2004 and 2015, it was 65% who had flat or declining income. And that means, of course, that there is a real reason why people have been hit by the financial crisis and other things. So I think to be able to counter these feelings, some are really real reasons and some are just opportunistic feelings. You need to have a really progressive system with the possibility, for example, to retrain, to have social security, to have a labor market policy, to have the possibility when you go from one job to another, to don't feel like your whole life system is under attack. And that is the difference between us as progressive. We don't put the whole weight on the individual person. We want society to take the responsibility. And I have written, for example, together with a leader of the blue-collar trade union, a strong defense and support of CETA and free trade, but with the notion that you need to have those active policies to counter what could be structural changes and so. So in Sweden, we go hand in hand, the Social Democrats in our government, which also is the Green, and the trade unions. And I think that's a very positive sign.
Yeah, that is great to hear trade unions supporting trade. Do you think it's fair to say, Anne, that in some ways it's going to take progressive governments and progressive leadership to actually maintain an open global economy? That it is going to be progressive governments that are able to provide this social safety net at home and this security are actually going to be, if we get it right, the best defenders of the open economy, the open global economy?
Yes, and I really like what you have been talking about a progressive trade agenda, because I think from the right wing, they don't recognize that there actually are things that we have to take into account, like workers' rights, the possibility to keep high standards for environment and animals and health and things like that. But we have, and we take responsibility for that. But we also understand that it's not enough just to put it in agreements, in trade agreements, for example. You have to have a policy, a national policy. What I think is difficult is now that we have not taken this discussion as left-wing politician or left-center, progressive, liberal, on the right side. I mean,
on the correct side.
On the correct side. On the correct side. Because we have said that is, for example, EU who should take that. They are responsible for trade. We as national politicians are not responsible. And we have let all those misunderstandings, the opportunistic views be much too hard. And in some countries, it might even be, if not too late, very, very difficult to get back on track on the right side of the free and open society, inclusive the free and open trade.
Okay, that perspective about the EU and national politicians not taking responsibility is really interesting to me. And I think maybe Jonas Storr, your geographic neighbor, also our neighbor of Norway, might have a really valuable perspective on that as well. Please, Jonas.
Well, we are not members of the EU, just like Canada, but closely associated. My take on this, I think, you know, there's one trap we may enter into as social democrats on this anti-globalization thing. And that is that we have an elitist approach to these notions. When I travel around in Norway and meet people at the workplace, I don't meet many people who talk about globalization. They talk about jobs, income, opportunities for kids. So if we sit down around those tables and say, let's talk about globalization, you know, again, we are taking a step away from their everyday life. Just, you know, one reflection on that.
So you think we just shouldn't use the word?
Well, but I think, you know, it's becoming a kind of elitist interpretation of the mood. You know, Brexit and Trump and all the rest of it is a kind of an anti-globalization thing. It's an abstract. That's an abstract. You may describe some of these forces that influence, but where I feel we have to be on the right side is not to cut the ties with our base. And when we govern in democracies, we have to adapt our speed and our progress with that link. And once we are out of touch with our base, we stop to be representative and we lose elections. I think that's one point. Now, so how do we win elections? And speaking from a perspective where I spend all my life thinking about how to win elections, and I feel pretty confident.
I think a lot of us feel that.
Yeah, but you have won elections, and I think I will win elections. And I think good advice there is really to go back to the sources. And there's one source in our movement which trumps most sources, and that is work. We have to go back to the notion of work. And I envisage in the party program we will present for our next elections that work will be the prism through which we see most of the other things we would like to achieve. So there are two things here. One is the security for work, that you get a job, which we know, fighting unemployment, trying to have an active policy for securing work. But the other notion, which is gaining in importance, is the quality of work. And the feeling people have that, you know, work is becoming less secure and more exposed to dangers, to the whole quality of the notion. So, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about caring for the elderly, how are we going to deal with that? Well, it is through work. We're not going to create smart cities with less emission through some kind of fancy technological thing. It's going to be people who do it through their work. And that brings me to some of those key issues where policy have to deliver on training, on skills, on the rethinking of education, which is not something only happens during early years, but the making lifelong learning real. And engaging some of our social model, which at least we practice in the Nordic countries, of very strong collaboration with social partners. The social partners are given responsibility in the way we practice a part of our redistribution and our wealth creation mechanisms. So, you know, summing up, I think that if we really take these issues in people's daily lives seriously, let's deal with the issues and not create a super language on top of that, which becomes kind of academic and abstract.
Okay, you remind me a lot of here to Australia, because Jonas, when you talk about focusing on work and getting back to your roots, that is very evocative to me of at least what, from a distance, it looks as if under your leadership, Labour is doing in Australia. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, Bill, and also how it connects with Australia being connected to a global economy, because, you know, Australia, like Sweden, like Canada, like Germany, like Norway, like Greece, but especially, you know, some of our countries are very, very exposed to the global economy. We can't turn away. So talk about those things, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Australia is a trading nation. We're an island, a big island. Other than our first Australians, everyone in Australia is an immigrant within the last 200 years. 27 in every 100 Australians was born overseas. So I think other than Luxembourg and Israel, we are genuinely the most immigrant country in the world. So we have connections overseas and we trade. But there is a great deal of concern about free trade in our country. Now the Conservatives in power, and of course because we're in the southern hemisphere, we do everything back to front. Our Conservative government's called Liberal, and that's the only thing liberal about them, their name. They have pursued a trade agenda, and my opposition has supported agreements with Japan, with Korea. We proposed amendments to the China Free Trade Agreement. But there is a great mounting degree of scepticism that somehow in Australia we have open markets and we play on a not level playing field. Our manufacturing sector has been hollowing out. We've been hit by a high dollar because of the commodities boom. We're rich in minerals. But of course, the downside of having a strong currency is that our manufacturing and other sectors become less competitive. And the challenge for Labor is how to walk that centre line of open engagement with the rest of the world, but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, still retaining good quality jobs in Australia. Our unemployment rate's about 5.8%, which is a good headline number relatively. But of the 12 million Australians who work, about 4 million are in part-time or casual work. And while some people choose part-time and casual work, we regularly have over 1 million Australians who wish they had more work. You add on nearly 1 million people with disabilities, you add on the actual number of unemployed and discouraged job seekers. The challenge on a trade agenda is part of a bigger challenge. How do we convince people that the economy is working for them? In the last election, the general election we just had 3 months ago, Labor against the Liberals secured 49.7% of the vote, so we improved our position, but as you can appreciate, that's not 50%. But one of the propositions we're advancing is a strong safety net. Australia has a strong social democratic tradition. We have a very well-established safety net, but for a lot of people in the middle class and our working class, they're feeling left behind. The benefits seem to go to some and not all. The current government also tends to prioritise labour mobility in their trade agreements. We tend to, in our trade agreements, when we're in government, prioritise capital mobility. We have over 1 million people on temporary work visas in Australia, so they're from overseas, and they have the ability to work, and that's probably the source of some lack of consensus. So our challenge in Australia is how to build a pro-growth consensus. At the centre of that has to be a skills agenda, an infrastructure agenda, and of course it's got to include the middle and working class. So to sum up how we're approaching it, we think the top 1% can look after themselves. They'd have a good track record of doing that. Our challenge is to be consistent with middle class and working class families, maintain a strong safety net, a strong minimum wage, a strong national health care, and access universal lifelong learning, and hopefully that agenda will triumph in the next couple of years. In fact, it will.
Do you share Jonas's confidence that you're going to get there?
Yeah.
Yeah?
The other side. That's a separate issue.
On those top 1%, you know, we in our campaign, and some people thought that this was a real mistake, campaigned on an explicitly redistributionist tax agenda. We said we would lower taxes for people in the middle and raise taxes on the 1%, which was sort of in line with what I had written as a journalist, but I now represent a constituency called University Rosedale, which includes one of Canada's most affluent communities. So I had the experience of knocking on doors, and people would say, "Hi, so you're going to raise my taxes and you want me to vote for you?" And they did, actually, which was great. I was so proud of Rosedale. But are you guys going to do that? Do you think you said the 1% can look after themselves? Should they pay a little bit more to help everybody else?
We did have all national budgets, government budgets, are under pressure. We ran on a strategy of rescinding or rolling back some of the tax concessions to the top end. In Australia, you can get a payment, you get a tax concession if you keep buying houses. Now that challenges, that, you know, I think distorts the housing market. So we said we would wind back the concessions. We have proposed keeping a slightly higher tax rate on the top taxpayers. It's about 2.5% of Australians. We also propose other measures, but our sort of approach is budget repair that is fair. We've started to talk about inclusive growth and shared prosperity, but we have a saying in Australia, a fair go all round, which is another way, I think, of talking about inclusive growth. But fairness we've certainly projected strongly in the election, which means that how can a government cut pensions or cut services for children's dental care or not properly fund our universities or childcare, which we have universal childcare, at the same time as hand away tax concessions to the top end disproportionately to get the benefit? We in Australia have a bell-shaped tax system. If you earn no money and you have nothing, you don't pay tax, but there's a clear downside to that. Then in the middle, you've got your pay-as-you-go tax earners, the people who go to work every day. But at the other end, if you're really well off in our country, you can use all the exceptions in the system, you can put your money overseas. So we have a bell-shaped tax system. And that, I think, is breaking down confidence in the whole system. So it's not a matter of just not reducing government spending. Social democratic governments have to reduce spending. But the idea that you're going to keep pumping out tax concessions which don't create the dynamic production of income, but instead just go to passive investment and allow the accumulation of investment capital, that's not a sustainable economic proposition, and we think we can win that argument. In fact, we're sure we're going to win that argument. We got a big swing to us last time, and we've taken issues which for 30 years were regarded as too hard, going after tax concessions at the top end. But we didn't. I think we will do better even as people fully understand our views and we fine-tune it. In Australia, we have there's 55 people who earn over $1 million. There's many people who earn millions of dollars, but we found 55 people who earned over $1 million who paid no tax at all, not even our national health care levy. How can you do that? So we think that going after the top-end tax concessions, not in a sort of a crazy way, but a sensible, balanced way, is one of the ways which you can still maintain a proper safety net in a modern nation. There's no choice. We think that's the way to go.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Now, Nikos, I've been struck listening to everyone at the extent to which, Tolstoy's line in Anna Karenina, happy families are all alike, unhappy families are unique in their unhappiness. It's sort of the opposite. All of our unhappiness is similar, right? Everyone talking about their countries, I think it resonates. But Greece has been through a particularly difficult set of challenges. So how, from that perspective of certainly of all the countries represented here having been hit the hardest by the financial crisis and its repercussions in Europe, how is a progressive agenda looking now, and particularly, how is Greece thinking about its connection with the rest of the world, particularly your European partners who are right here?
Well, you're right to say that Greece must be a counterexample of what we shouldn't be doing when a crisis occurs. And what we shouldn't be doing at any cost is give away the hardcore of the progressive agenda. Your book is titled The Plutocrats. That's purely Greek word. So the problem with those guys is not that they only make tremendous amounts of money, but they create bubbles. And the bubbles affect national economies and put them into crisis. So the first thing we progressives need to do is to explain to our people that isolation does not save you from these kinds of crises. So these kinds of crises elsewhere, and this elsewhere is far beyond his or her democratic control. I think this has to do with the core values that progressive, center-left and left parties are serving. And in that respect, we should never allow such crises to jeopardize our values. For example, in Greece, we had 2.5 million people that had lost their insurance. So practically, some months ago, until we passed the latest legislation, they had no access to medication, no access to medical care. Think of Greece. A massive progressive party paid the burden of applying this kind of extreme policies. So Greece must be a counterexample for all progressive parties, and we should preserve our values and try to understand that, for example, servicing our debt is a very crucial issue, but this has not, must not happen at the expense of any growth prospect. So a clear message that democracy has to be broadened, and we should all together decide to put both legs in the European Union.
Jonas, want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in the notion of technology. We're talking about, a language and a narrative politically that we can use in the midst of this fundamental technological change. Now, An's Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, he has this expression which I often quote. He was leader of the metal workers in Sweden, and he was asked this question as a union leader. Do you fear new technology? And his answer was no, I fear old technology. And I think that's a very interesting sentence, because it is almost like a social contract. He can say that because he knows that working people are carried along. So you can take in new technology, create growth, create values, have redistributive policies, and training skills. In other settings, you do fear new technology because you know you will lose your job and there will be nothing else to replace it. So to me, really, I think that's a high standard sentence. If you can really say that you don't fear new technology, it's opportunity, then you're on the right side of the balance in your policy. If people have reason really to fear new technology, you're in deep trouble.
That is such a great line. I have to say, my father is a farmer, and I grew up working on the farm, and I had some very bad experiences with old technology, in particular a tractor where the brakes weren't working, and I only learned that going downhill, pulling a plow. So old technology is dangerous in many ways, but I think Anne wanted to jump in.
Yes, I think what Nico said about not speaking and having a dialogue with people and taking decisions over people's head, as well as was Jonas was saying about talking to people, not about globalization, but about jobs and ordinary things. That is so important, and I think that we have failed there in a way, not to have the discussion with people, and also to try to move the responsibility to somewhere else. And I think when it comes, for example, to trade, you cannot vote on globalization, you cannot vote on structural changes, you cannot vote on technological revolution, but you can't say no to a trade agreement. So you put everything you don't like into that and make it a symbol for everything. And then it's, of course, if you haven't had that dialogue with people, it becomes very difficult then to get people to understand why do we think this is good, because we haven't even talked about it. And this also goes for EU. I think that Brexit is a typical example where there have been too little discussion and too much blaming on someone else, and in this case someone else is EU, instead of taking responsibility also for these decisions that you, as a national politician, has been taken.
Okay, I see Sigmar needs to jump in there. He's holding his microphone.
No, I very much agree. I mean, you're right when you say it's not clever to discuss with our voters about globalization, because they want to have answers to the education of their kids, of their jobs, but we should remember that for 25, 30 years, we always explained to our voters that unfortunately we have to lower the wages, unfortunately we have to be flexible on the labor market, unfortunately we could not spend enough money for pensions because of globalization and global competition. And especially Social Democrats were on the way. I remember the so-called third way of Tony Blair and also Gerd Schröder and others, and they remember very well that we were part of this system. So, and now it happens like you said, that they can project everything to those global trade agreements, to whatever they think what will happen with their life in future. But I want to say, we are discussing what should progressives do. I mean, 5 minutes ago we discussed about the taxation. Look to Europe, what happened there. And this narrative that we need to strengthen the competitiveness, we lowered the taxes and there was no possibility for a common tax legislation in Europe. The narrative was, the more competition you have by taxes in Europe, the better it would be for every country, because they will compete for investments. And at the end of the day, through this trickle-down effect, everything would be better than before. Now we see that during the financial crisis, my country has to help countries, for example, like Ireland. Ireland just became a letter from the European Commission There is no commissioner for taxation because it's a national issue, but it's the commissioner, Mrs. Vestager, for competition. And they said, what Ireland did with the taxation of companies like Apple is a forbidden subsidy, because they had a tax cut by 13 billion euros. They have to pay back to Ireland. In my country, people said, what kind of Europe this is? We have to lend money to Ireland, and they did not get the taxes from Apple. For example, Apple has a company in Germany which sells computers. They have a revenue by 500 million euros, half a billion. What they send to the financial institutions is that they have a net win by 10 million. By 10 million. And therefore, these 10 million they want to pay in taxes. What's the trick? They say, unfortunately, we have to pay licenses for the headquarter in Ireland. And so at the end of the day, in Germany, we earn only 10 million. The rest we have to pay for the license to the headquarter in Ireland. And there they have to pay 0.0005%. It's the same for Starbucks. It's the same for Amazon. And people ask themselves, what kind of European Union is it where a baker store has to pay higher tax rates than an international company like Starbucks or Apple? What is the difficulty? Progressive governments in Europe are not able to change the rules. I have a conservative finance minister.
We all have small c conservative finance.
Yes. He is willing to change the rules. He is willing to have a taxation for finance markets. Who is against? Socialist governments in Europe. And it's very difficult to explain our voters why they should vote for us if, as long as we are in the opposition, we have excellent ideas for a better world. And the moment we are going in the government, we say, oh, maybe it's better to have a secure financial market inside our country, and then we are far away from international cooperation. And as long as we are not able to change this narrative, to change this form of not cooperating for more justice and more fairness, people will not vote for us. Sometimes they will vote for a while for a social democrat government, then they will change to the right wing or to the very right wing, or they will not go to vote. And I think we have to be very clear that there are some mistakes we did in the past we should not prolong in the future.
I think that's a great point, Sigmar. I see Bill itching to say something, but I'm just going to interject one thought here, which is, I think there is a clear and evident contradiction in how globalization works right now, in that capital is global, but social safety nets are national, and taxation is national. And one of the very big challenges, probably beyond our panel today, that we're going to have to address, if we're progressives, Canadian government very much believes in a social welfare state. If we believe in that, we need to have a tax base to support it. And in a world where capital is global, we're going to have to get together and figure out some rules of the road.
There are some ideas which we had in the past. This financial transaction tax, for example. And I mean, what you said, I said it in the round at the lunch with the Prime Minister of Canada.
Everybody else wasn't here, so share.
The first meeting of Social Democrats, of Progressive, of the Labour movement was 1898 in Paris. there the 1st of May was founded as a fighting day for the workers' rights all over the world. 1898. And if you look at the documents, you will find the sentence where they said, look, the capitalism is national organized. The only thing we can do, or the only weapon we have, is the international solidarity of labor. Now we are a little bit more than 120 years later, and we can see the only thing which is internationalized is the capitalism. And the progressive parties are always national orientated. So I think that's obvious, that it's impossible to save our citizens without having international rules, which gives us the right for taxation, where we can offer the public goods and do more, and especially taxation which helps us to solve some of the international difficulties. I mean, when I was in September 2015 in Jordan in a refugee camp, and I asked the camp leader, since which time people in the camp want to go to Europe or to Germany. He said, maybe 3 months ago nobody discussed about this. But when the World Food Program was cut from $27 per month per capita to $13, when the UN has to close the schools and hospitals around the refugee camp, then people thought, now it's time to leave. And so we also need a fair taxation for the international responsibilities we have. And it's impossible to explain our citizens, we are sorry, we cannot invest in schools and in social security, we need our monies for refugees. At the same time, we have no taxation for the global capitalism. So that's the reason I think we should join hands. If not, the right-wingers and the internationalists, they will have more and more the power to convince the voters.
Okay, that is a worrying prospect, and I think Anne and Bill want to jump in. Okay. We'll maybe have a European conversation, then we'll go to the Commonwealth.
No, I think it is very important to talk about the right to taxation and so on, but I also think that that we need not only to concentrate on the free markets and free flow of capital, but also to having safety nets and on the European level in a way that we have a social Europe. Not to have the same for everybody, but to agree that we need to have social safety nets for everybody. Actually, the former Social Democratic Minister of Finance, Allan Larsson, he has just come out with a proposal for a social pillar in EU, with 3 different kinds, how to get access to labour market, how to get a social security net, and also to have equality in the labour market. And this is now out on a dialogue until December to see what people think about this. And it's more of benchmarking, agreeing that we cannot only have a European Union that is mainly positive for capital and goods, but not for people. And I think this is an important part of what we are talking about. The other thing I wanted to say is that we have mentioned it here earlier today, but you also need to have understanding from those companies that Sigmar is talking about, that you cannot just grab everything, you cannot just decide not to be decent. And that's why on the 21st next week there will be a launching of the Global Deal, which is an initiative originally from the Swedish Prime Minister, but now from Canada, Bangladesh, and several other countries. It will be kind of a handshake between industry, trade unions, governments, on kind of having fair rules and dialogues, and accept not to exploit people, but to accept to have a good conditions also for companies, and not to try to take the best and don't give a damn about how people or climate or anybody else their situation. And I think this global deal is a new step forward, and I think it could be starting of a new dialogue in this respect.
Okay, thank you for talking about that concrete initiative that I agree. I think it's a really important one. Bill?
Australia doesn't have any tax havens. Like, we're very happy that European countries are noticing the loss of revenue, national revenue by the use of tax havens, but some of the European countries administer tax havens, and maybe not through their metropolitan nations, but I don't know where the Isle of Man is, but it's somewhere close to England. You look at some of those Caribbean nations, European countries do have more say over this system, and as an Australian there's a little bit of frustration. The funny thing about Brexit is now Australia can do trade agreements with Britain and with Europe, which we previously couldn't do. Anyway, there's a silver lining. I think also flags of convenience in shipping. The international seafarers unions have been talking about trying to make flags of convenience shipping nations a lot more accountable. That's something we can do together so that our seafarers are paid properly and you have ships which are safe and don't jeopardise the environmental security of our regions. We think that the ILO should be given more support. I think also campaigning more internationally about the rights of women. The more that women get equal treatment, not in Australia as well, but that's an economic strategy which I think social democratic parties can pursue globally. Wherever women have gained access in terms of improvements in health, wherever mothers are treated better, wherever there's improvements in infant mortality, wherever there's greater access to literacy and learning, that generates the wealth of the world. I also agree with what the Vice-Chancellor said. The more support we can put into those first neighbouring nations around Iraq and Syria in terms of refugees, it just has benefits not only for those refugees but for the downstream immigration of people seeking to leave those environments. I've got no doubt, and in Australia there's a high degree of bipartisanship about some of this, but we think that there is lots of sensible initiatives which social democratic parties can take. I mean, one of the challenges, and I speak to Matt Brown before, is other than Australia and New Zealand, this is a European North American conversation. Now I know it's difficult perhaps to get leaders from Africa and from Asia and from South America, but part of our challenge is to, I think, build up democratic institutions throughout the whole world. In Australia, we see Asia as our future. We love Europe, but we see Asia as our future. We think China is a giant economic machine, and it's going to keep generating growth. You've got India. We regard ourselves... Australia's always been too far away from Europe and Canada, but we're right on the border of Asia, so we're right in the middle of the action. So it's in our interests to see debates such as the panel are raising, lifting living standards in Asia, and they're doing it themselves anyway. But I think there's opportunities for social democratic parties to pursue our agenda of environmental, equal treatment, equal rights. And I'm sure as you've got a growing middle class throughout China and Asia, we're very bullish about the rise of China and the rise of Asia generally. We think there's opportunities there to be pursued on our value base.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill, for reminding us about the rest of the world. I'm glad also you mentioned the ILO, which while we're talking about solidarity and labour working together is really important. And something I'm really proud our government did is when we formed government, Canada had signed up to 6 of the 8 ILO conventions. We've signed up to the 7th now already. We have an 8th left to go, but we're working on it and we're going to do it soon. So I think it's important to remember, even as we're talking about new things to do, there are some existing institutions that we need to really put our shoulder into. Do you want to?
It'll be a social democratic legacy. The investment you put into the arts in your country, not everything is economic, and sometimes there's more than one way to get from A to B. And I think that investment in the arts is not something which people have spoken about, but I think that's a good social democratic strategy. Nations, we're not just economies, we're communities, and I think there's plenty of innovation going on in your country, which I just wanted to note from our perspective. Very clever stuff.
Okay, we're going to invite him back.
Yeah.
Definitely. And as you were speaking about women, I'm going to invite you and challenge you. I'm glad to hear you're planning to win your next election. And I encourage you to take an example from our Prime Minister and have a 50-50 gender balance cabinet. I have to say, I travel around the world a lot in my job, and I have been astonished at the extent to which that single act by our Prime Minister has resonated around the world. Wherever I go, people come up to me. Often it's like younger women from kind of patriarchal countries, younger women in the delegation, and they come up to me and they say, because it's 2015, because it's 2015. It's a powerful and important thing to do.
From 1994.
They did it in 1994. But Anne says it's still good that we've caught up. As Sigmar said over lunch, I think all we social democrats always look north to Sweden for examples.
We did it in 1990.
1990!
Even with a woman prime minister.
Yeah, okay. They go there too. Okay, what can you say, the Nordics? Our time is running out, and I thought maybe by way of conclusion, I could ask each of the panelists, and I found it. Yeah, there you go. Each of the panelists to offer just one concluding thought of what's the one initiative that you would like us to take home with us as an idea, that as a global progressive group we should be doing to advance this conversation about how we have progressive globalization. What's the one thing you'd like us to work on? Okay, Janice seems like he's ready.
Well, pretty broad question. Well, I advise against, the kind of globalization speak trap.
Okay, so don't even ask the question the way I did. I'm sorry,
which can be alienating people. At the same time, I think Minister Dahlberg made a good point earlier that we have to keep explaining why trade is important and how the world is connected, because going into reverse on all of those issues is bad in the long run. It's bad for work, it's bad for the quality in our communities. So I think still, the progressive movement is an open movement, it's a positive movement, it's a movement for opportunity. So we have to keep, struggling for that. Even if we meet some dark forces from the populist right, who seem to have the wind now, they can be, we can stand up against them, and I think that is very important.
Okay, I like that. And you might know one of our political slogans in Canada with our new government is sunny ways. It's a quotation from an early Liberal Prime Minister, so you can borrow that. Nikos?
Yes, I think the core message should be that progressive and left parties should internationalize the policies that made them a successful historical example in the post-Second World War era. So, it is questionable whether national welfare states can resist globalization. So we have to unionize all the agenda that distinguishes this group of parties from conservatives and right-wing, and internationalize and unionize democracy, transparency, and the rule of law.
Okay, thank you. Sigmar?
I would say we should have one narrative, that globalization for us means welfare for everybody, not richness for somebody. This must be the narrative, we should not resist globalization. We should have another narrative for globalization than the conservatives or the neoliberals has. And for me it is, if somebody asks us, or in Germany it's, every week somebody comes in and says, what's the vision of the social democracy? And my answer is, to make globalization in a way that welfare to everybody is the target and not richness for somebody.
Okay, I like that. Bill?
Your question was not just about globalisation, was it? I think if social democratic parties, and I'll start with my own, if we could just make sure that if we just delivered on the equal treatment of women in all forms of our society, then we'd be the richest country in the world and our movement would be the most successful in the world. A fair go for all must start with equal treatment for women. That's not a trade agenda, I think that's But I'd like to be part of a movement which is known for the full emancipation of people, that we stand for equality for all, and fair treatment of women is the...
But I think it can be part of the trade agenda. At my first trade conference, I actually somewhat horrified Australia's then trade minister, the great Andrew Robb, by starting a speech saying we would have a feminist trade policy. You know him, you can imagine what his reaction was.
Yeah, he wouldn't have understood what you were saying.
He was surprised. Yeah.
Well, being a Minister of Trade and being moderated by a Minister of Trade in Canada, I think I use my last minutes to say that I don't think we should blame all the wrongdoings of other things on trade agreements. Instead, that trade agreements in a right way, in a new way, in a progressive way, could lead to jobs and prosperity. And that is why, for the first time ever, we have such a proposal. And that is the CETA agreement. There has never, ever been so much protection for climate and human workers' rights, and the possibility for having trade not dictated by low-wage countries who want to sell a lot of goods without taking care of climate and human being and workers' rights. This is the first time this has happened, and I think we will be doing a big mistake if we don't take this chance and agree between EU and Canada to have the first ever progressive trade deal.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Anne. I had like some brilliant abstract things to say, but I'm not going to say them, and I'm just going to echo what you said. And sort of in the corridors, in addition to our philosophical discussion, Nikos and Anne and Sigmar and I have been talking about CETA, which is a great, I think, the most progressive trade agreement that has ever been agreed. We're on the verge of getting it signed this fall, and hopefully ratified by a vote in the European Parliament early next year. And I do think it's a big piece of that progressive, I'm not going to say globalization, that progressive open global society, progressive open world strategy that we all really practically are working on together. Thank you to my excellent colleagues and panelists. You guys did a great job, very fascinating.